Say a prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you that we can come this morning once again to study your word. We thank you for giving us this opportunity to be here. We thank you for the books of Daniel and Revelation. We know, Lord Jesus, you told us that we should understand the book of Daniel. And help us as we study this. Give us clarity with the settings and the tools that you've been giving us, that we may understand the events of these last days in their proper context. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, as we look at this information was first given to me in 2012, and it was sent to me from two different sources around the same time saying, you should check this out. And I started to check it out. I have gone through Daniel 11 a number of times, piece by piece, trying to just study through the history, studying Uriah Smith, studying Stephen Haskell and A.T. Jones, making lots of notes on trying to put all the pieces together. Along the way, I noticed that Haskell had a slightly different approach to Daniel 11 than Uriah Smith, who was basically Millerite. But it's obviously good to have that framework of understanding of the pioneers upon which to take to build on that platform. So what we're looking for all the time is building on the platform of the pioneers, not saying, well, that's what the pioneers believed and that was applicable back then, but now we're going to do something completely different with a completely new method of interpretation, a new way of interpreting. No, we can't do that. And so in this presentation, I believe that there is material that it needs more work, but I believe this is the direction that has the best merit that I can see so far. There's one thing, and when we get to look at these presentations, and there's a number of them, there's a statement in reference to the United States and the Sunday law, and I think many of you will be able to finish this statement, that national apostasy will be followed by national ruin. So that means that the United States is going to come to ruin. It's going to completely unravel. And that's what happened to Egypt. And we need to keep that in mind in terms of the position of the United States. I mean, it's as we listen to some of this material, it's not... and when we say these things, if you think about national ruin, I've read A.T. Jones make the comment, if there's one place on earth that you don't want to be at that time, it's the United States. Well, you remember that statement? Now, that's a ministration of death. This maybe most of the 144,000 are going to come out of the United States. But of course, it's going to be an international Sunday law, and it's going to go everywhere. I mean, it's going to happen. So, yeah. So, and of course, for those who are statute keepers and walking in the law of the Lord, you're in the Lord's hands, and But this is important to remember: is that the United States is going to be ruined. It's going to come to its end in its current form. And so just keep that in mind. Now, some of the history as we go through, some of the bits and pieces are going to go over your head because it's new information. Don't worry about it. Just pick up the bits that you can and we can discuss those. But I think this first presentation you'll find you'll be able to follow it fairly easily. And you'll see in the beginning, as you mentioned before, Danny, that Nimrod is indeed Gilgamesh. He makes that connection. And it's quite interesting, some of the things he says about some of the statues. You have a picture of Gilgamesh or Nimrod, and he's actually got a lion that's much smaller than him, and in reference to the size of men even back then. You'll see some of the statues. So let's have a watch of this first presentation called The Genesis of History, and just prayerfully look at this, recognizing that there may be some parts, I think this one's quite sound, but as we continue, there'll be some parts that need revision or more expansion and adjusting in some of the details. That's how I'm seeing it. So let's have a look at that now.
the genesis of history, type and antitype. In Revelation we are told, I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the ending. And we wonder what this means. But we're told in 6th Bible Commentary, page 1092, that when the students of prophecy shall set their hearts to know the truths of Revelation, they will realize what an importance is attached to this search. Christ Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, the genesis of the Old Testament and the revelation of the New. And so we see that everything that starts in Genesis speaks of Christ, and everything that ends in Revelation speaks of Christ. In fact, all threads of truth that begin in Genesis end in Revelation. And if it ends in Revelation, it's because it has begun in Genesis. And so what we're going to look at is we're going to see these threads of truth. We're going to trace them from Genesis all the way through to Revelation. In Manuscript Releases, Volume 7, page 417, we're told, the Bible has accumulated and bound up together its treasures for this last generation. All the great events and solemn transactions of the Old Testament history have been and are repeating themselves in the church in these last days. And so here we see clearly that the Bible is essentially a record of events that would be repeated and have their ultimate fulfillment in the last days during the final generation. Now when we look at Genesis, we read about the first kingdom in Genesis chapter 10. And we know that this kingdom was created by Babel, and its builder was Nimrod. And we read, Nimrod began to be a mighty one in the earth, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Out of that land he went forth into Ashur, and builded Nineveh, and the city of Rehoboth, and Calah, and Rezin, in Genesis 10:10-11. And so Nimrod created the first kingdom that was based in the land of Shinar, and part of that kingdom included the city of Akkad, but then he went and conquered the land of Ashur, and he built some more cities. And so Babel becomes the prototypical Babylon, and we'll see this as we go along. Now, if we study history, we'll realize that Shinar, according to secular history, is called Sumer. When we study the history of Sumer, we find that there was two dynasties. One was based in Babel, and the other one was based in Akkad, which is one of the cities that Nimrod built. In this picture on the right, we can see a 2,500-year-old stone carving of Nimrod holding a lion. The Sumerians didn't call him Nimrod, they called him Gilgamesh in their language. But this is still Nimrod, and it's interesting to see the size of the lion relative to the size of Nimrod. But animals have suffered less from the effects of sin, although they still suffered, than man has. Now, what do we learn about Nimrod? Well, first of all, Nimrod magnified himself above God. The Bible tells us he was a mighty hunter against the Lord. Now, what he did is that he created a new world order. Before there were no kingdoms, and he set up a kingdom ruled by a king himself. And he did this by training men in the use of arms and creating the first armies. And because nobody else knew what an army was, he was quite easily able to conquer all of the surrounding tribes and create his kingdom. One of the benefits that he had is that everybody spoke one common language. And he introduced the worship of mother and child, and all of these points come back. They all prefigured or foreshadowed what was to come. Nimrod also instigated the worship of the sun and the moon, and Sunday worship. Now, after God had confused their tongues, while the people of the earth dispersed, not everybody left the land of Shinar or the land of Ashur. Some people remained there, and those that remained there were ruled over by a new king based in the city of Akkad instead of the city of Babel, which is where Nimrod was ruling from. In Genesis, after reading about Babel, we read about another kingdom, And we read about this kingdom in Genesis 14. The king that was head over this kingdom was called Chedorlaomer. Now, this is a gold statue on the right of a king of Elam. Now, we don't know which king it was, but it's about the right time frame, about 1500 BC, 2000 to 1500 BC. And again, we notice the size of the goat relative to the size of the man. It's quite interesting. We read in Genesis, and it came to pass in the days of Aramphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. And 12 years they served Chedorlaomer. So what we see here is that the king of Elam, either through conquest or through alliances with these other kings of Elasar and Shinar, actually ruled over all of them. And those kings all got together and went to conquer Canaan. And we know what happened because he ran into Abraham. Before we talk about Abraham, let's go back and look at secular history. What does it tell us about this kingdom? Well, there's a 4,000-year-old text in cuneiform called the Curse of Agade. And this text that has been found tells us how the Akkadian dynasty was actually overthrown by a tribe called the Gutians that came from the east. Now, soon after the Gutians and destroyed the city of Akkad, they were followed by another tribe called the Elamites, who established themselves as the regional power. And so they took over and ruled in the land of Shinar, or Sumer. It was during this period of Elamite rule that Abraham was called out of Mesopotamia, which had been the kingdom of Nimrod. And so this is where Abraham goes into the promised land. And we read in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 127, that the call from heaven first came to Abraham while he dwelt in Ur of the Chaldees. It was a large company that set out from Mesopotamia. And so this is a regional map that we can have a look at. On the map you can see Sumer, which is a small part of Nimrod's empire, Mesopotamia, from which Abraham came out of. Now, if you look on the far right, you'll see that Gutia is to the far right of Mesopotamia, and Elam is also to the right, but it's to the south. After the Elamites had ruled over Sumer and had tried to conquer Canaan, we next read about another kingdom that arises from Genesis chapter 41 all the way through to 1 King chapter 15. And this kingdom was actually Egypt. We're told that now there arose a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, in Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 and 11. And Egypt was actually quite a strong regional power, quite a strong kingdom. And even though the Exodus sort of devastated Egypt for a while, they recouped their power. And so we read in 1 Kings chapter 14, for example, that it came to pass that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. And he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king's house, he even took away all. So all these kingdoms have a bearing upon God's people. In some way or another they afflict God's people. And we see that Egypt extended past the Red Sea and actually the entire coast of Palestine, all the way right up into the north near the Hittite Empire. And Egypt ruled from about 1500 to about 1200 BC. Now Egypt as a power came from the west. Egyptian history tells us that they had one great king called Menes, who unified the various tribes of Egypt into a nation and created the first kingdom. We don't know very much about him, but essentially ever after there was always tension between what was known as Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, while the Gutians and Elamites had overthrown the Akkadian dynasty, and invaded the land of Shinar, they didn't destroy Babylon. They actually ruled from Babel. It was only during the Egyptian Empire that Babylon was destroyed. And it was actually destroyed not by the Egyptians, but by the Hittites, who were actually in alliance with Egypt. And so Babylon was destroyed during the time of the Third Kingdom. And this is an important detail. We're going to come back to this as well. In fact, we're going to come back to all of these points. Now, one thing we know about Egypt is that they had advanced scientific knowledge. And we read about the proverbial wisdom of the Egyptians in 1 Kings chapter 4:30. Their scientific knowledge was so advanced, in fact, that we still don't know how they were able to build the pyramids. And the pyramids are only a small part of it. There are texts found in papyrus dating from about 1400 BC that actually describe the way the brain works. Not only that, but there are found granite bowls. And granite is the hardest stone. It's very, very hard to carve. Perfectly shaped that balance on a pinhead. And we can't do this today. So they had advanced scientific knowledge. The other aspect of Egypt is that they primarily had a secular culture. On one hand, it was pantheistic and they worshipped just about everything that moved. On the other hand, it was quite atheistic. And we know this is the case because when Moses went to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go," Pharaoh said, "Who's God? Who is he that I should obey him?" What tends to happen when you have lots and lots of gods is that they all become rather insignificant. And so this culture becomes quite secular. Secular culture doesn't have to be atheistic. It can be religious, but religion, while perhaps being very prominent, plays a secondary role as a motivating power. And this is what Egyptian culture was like. About this time, during the Third Kingdom, some drastic changes happen to God's people. First change is that there's a reorganization. Under Moses, the church in the wilderness, as we're told in the New Testament, the church in the wilderness became independent. It had been subservient to Egypt, but it becomes independent, an independent state, an independent nation. And it was reorganized away from the patriarchal model to a Levitical priesthood. So there's two main changes that happen as part of that reorganization. At the same time, about the middle of this Egyptian period, while David and Solomon were ruling, the church, or Israel, prospered materially. And the third thing that happened is that towards the end of this period, of the Third Kingdom, or the Egyptian kingdom, is that Israel fell away from faithfulness and began imitating the surrounding nations and adopted worship of pagan gods soon after Solomon had passed away. So under this Third Kingdom we have this entire transition of God's church from its reorganization, it's becoming independent, becomes prosperous and then falls away. And again, we're going to come back to this. These things are all types, of which the antitype is the real fulfillment. Egypt was succeeded by another kingdom. And we read about this kingdom in 2 Kings. We sort of move past Genesis now. And in 2 Kings chapter 15 to 23, we read about this fourth kingdom. And this fourth kingdom was Assyria. And on the right you have a diagram of the way the Assyrian soldiers used to dress. Probably the most well-known king is the king called Sennacherib. And we read in 2 Kings 15:29, "In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and took Kadesh and Hazor and Gilead and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and carried them away to Assyria. And now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them," in 2 Kings 18:13. In fact, not only did he come up against Jerusalem, but he carried away 200,000 captives. So this is the fourth kingdom that afflicts God's people. Now if we look at the Assyrian Empire here, the map, it lasted from about 1200 BC to about 627 BC. And you can see that it was based up here in the north where Nineveh is, and it came south and took Babylon, and then Palestine and Egypt. It pushed southeast towards Elam. It was a proud, ruthless nation. It was famous for the fact that when it conquered a nation, it either killed everybody in the entire nation, or those who weren't killed were deported, and the land was left absolutely desolate. It was the first nation to be this ruthless. Assyria was initially Israel's ally. In fact, the relationship between Israel and Assyria began because King Ahab actually asked Assyria to be its ally against the king of Damascus, or Syria. But eventually, Assyria got sick of Israel and destroyed it. So, while starting out being its friend, ends up being its enemy. And Assyria carried away 10 tribes of Israel and besieged Jerusalem during the time of Hezekiah. Now, perhaps most importantly is that Assyria actually relocated its capital to Babylon and accepted the religion of Babylon, and in so doing actually became an image of Babylon that was to come. And this is a very, very, very important point which we'll come back to. So, as a summary map, we notice that we started off talking about Babel or Babylon, and we noticed that Elam came from the east and pushed west, Egypt came from the west and pushed to the east, and Assyria came from the north and pushed south. Now have a look at this chart, and this summarizes what we've just said, but maybe in a slightly simpler way. At the top, we have a timeline consisting of the first, second, third, and fourth kingdom. And we see that when the first kingdom begins, a one world government is established. And shortly thereafter, or about that time, a man of sin arises, which in this case was Nimrod, a rebel against God. When the first kingdom ends, God's people are called out of Babylon, or Mesopotamia. This was Abraham who was called out, and he's called out about the time that the second kingdom is beginning. Now, the first kingdom isn't destroyed, its dominion is taken away, but it actually continues. Babel continued to function as a city. When the second kingdom overthrows it, it actually rules from Sumer. It sort of like takes it over. And the second kingdom rules for a while, and when it ends, there's an increase in knowledge, and when the second kingdom ends, the first kingdom is actually destroyed, together with the second kingdom. And this is a very important point. We'll come back to this. At this time, at the end of the second kingdom, the other thing that happens is that the fourth kingdom is founded. It doesn't rise to dominion, but it begins to exist as a nation. Now, during the third kingdom, the church is reorganized, as we've said, and then there's a falling away. And then at the end of the third kingdom, when the fourth kingdom begins, there's actually a change of government in the fourth kingdom, which is what enables it to become this dominating power. And in the case of Assyria, it was when Tiglath-Pileser became king, he actually reformed the entire government of Assyria. Before him, Assyria had been in civil war and hadn't been functioning very well. And so there's a change in the government of the fourth kingdom which enables it to come to power, and towards the end of the fourth kingdom it creates an image of the beast. In other words, it transforms itself into an image of the succeeding kingdom, which happened to be Babylon. And it did so by transferring its capital and adopting Babylonish religion. And at the end of the fourth kingdom, Israel is destroyed. Now, this timeline is very, very important. This timeline is a type of what was to happen. So let's look now at the antitype. What actually did happen? We know from Daniel's vision, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, that he saw a great metal man. And it had a head of gold, and then it had, after him, another kingdom which was inferior, and then a third kingdom of brass, and then a fourth kingdom which is strong as iron. We read about that in Daniel 2. verses 38 to 40. And we know that that is Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. But as we've just seen, the precursor to Babylon was Babel. And the precursor to Medo-Persia was Gutia and Elam. And the precursor to Greece was Egypt. And the precursor to Rome was Assyria. Now, if you hadn't noticed the parallels between these, we're going to go through them again. The first king was Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar actually magnified himself above God. And we know he did this because after having received the dream of the great metal man, he decided that that wasn't good enough and he was going to build his own version of it, which is an improvement above God. And then on another occasion he looked out and said, "Is it this great Babylon that I have built?" When he full knew that it was God that had given them the kingdom, and so he was struck down for 7 years. Now, what Nebuchadnezzar did is that he created a new world order. Because before him there'd been no universal kingdoms. They'd been regional powers, but they were fairly limited in what they could do. But Babylon actually created the first universal empire. And secular historians call this the Age of Empires, started by Nebuchadnezzar. And he subdued the world militarily, of course, just like Nimrod, and lo and behold, they spoke one common language. In fact, the book of Daniel is written both in Hebrew and Aramaic, and they both are very similar. They basically stem from the same common ancestor language. And so most of the world spoke one common language. Babylon continued the worship of the mother and child. And the mother, of course, is Ishtar, or Semiramis, and the child is Tammuz. And so that continued, and of course sun worship and moon worship was again re-established, because Babylon is where sun and moon worship originated from. Now, interestingly enough, Babylon took God's people captive for 70 years. Nebuchadnezzar saw himself as a second Nimrod, and Babylon as a second Babel. Some years ago they found a tablet inscribed, again in cuneiform, and this tablet was a few thousand years old. It's actually written by Nebuchadnezzar himself, and the inscription reads like this: "I have completed its magnificence with silver, gold, other metals, stone, enamelled bricks, fir and pine. The first, which is the house of the earth's base, the most ancient monument of Babylon, I built and finished it. A former king built it, they reckon 42 ages, but he did not complete its head. Since a remote time, people had abandoned it, without order expressing their words. Since that time the earthquake and thunder had dispersed the sun-dried clay. The bricks of the casing had been split, and the earth of the interior had been scattered in heaps. I did not change the site, nor did I take away its foundation. I set my hand to finish it and to exalt its head. As it had been in ancient days, so I exalted its summit." And that was translated by Mr. William Loftus in his books Travels and Researches in Chaldea and Sinai, page 29, London, published by James Nisbet, 1857. Nebuchadnezzar here is boasting of how he has restored Babel. After Babylon, a new kingdom arose, and we know that that kingdom was Medo-Persia. And we know that it came from the east. The Medes came up first, but the Persians were the stronger nation. Now, Medo-Persia didn't destroy Babylon. In fact, what they did is that they just evicted the Babylonian kings and preserved Babylon, actually set it up as a regional capital and preserved its culture. At this time, the Jews were called out of Babylon, back to the promised land. We need to recognize that the Gutians were the ancestors of the Medes, and the Elamites were the ancestors of the Persians. So the Gutians and Elamites were the Medes and the Persians. History is repeating. Now, after the Medes and the Persians, we know that Greece came up. And Greece came from the west. The empire of Greece eventually split into two warring parties, the king of the north and the king of the south, or as historians call it, the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire in the north. Now, it's interesting that Babylon was actually not destroyed by the Medes and the Persians, but was destroyed by the Greeks. They completely destroyed Babylon, and it was never again rebuilt. The Greeks are known for their advanced scientific knowledge. In fact, the Greeks were on the verge of discovering the steam engine. We know this from the archaeological artifacts that have been found. They had clock towers in all of their cities that kept the time accurately. They had mechanical calculators with gears for accurately calculating the position of the sun and the moon and the stars for any day of the year. They had quite advanced scientific knowledge. And lastly, what we know about the Greeks is that Plato, writing about 600 BC, tells in his history about the famous lawgiver of Greece, a man named Solon, how he actually went to Egypt to learn wisdom from the Egyptians, and how in Egypt he was told that the Greek gods were actually borrowed from Egypt. So the Egyptian religion was changed a little bit, but essentially continued living on in Greece. And the Greeks had a funny sort of mix of atheism and pantheism all at once, a little bit like the Egyptians. And so, in many respects, the Greeks are the continuation of the Egyptians. And we know that this is the case because the center of Greek or Hellenistic culture was actually based not in Greece, but in Alexandria in Egypt. And so Egypt was the base for the Greek culture. At the same time, during this third kingdom of Greece, there are some changes in God's church. Well, first of all, there's some reorganization. Ezra reiterated the law. Now, some years after he had passed away, about the time when the Greek Empire was arising, Israel actually became an independent nation. And this was granted to it by Alexander the Great because of a dream he'd had. Now, it's about this time when they became an independent nation that they actually reorganized the government of Israel and set up the Sanhedrin, which was the ruling civil and religious power in the nation. So, under Greece, we have this reorganization, the formation of the Sanhedrin, and Israel becoming independent, just like what happened at the time of Egypt under Moses. Now, again, about the middle of the Greek period, Israel began to prosper materially. And it actually was doing quite well for itself. And this prosperity again led to a falling away. And so towards the end of this period of the Third Kingdom, they started to adopt Hellenism. And Hellenism was all the philosophy of the Greeks. And this is why when Jesus came, they weren't quite sure about whether there was any resurrection or not. And many other things happened. So, for example, they built a gymnasium in the middle of Jerusalem so that they could have Olympic Games. Now, if you know anything about Olympic Games, first of all, you know that they're run in the honour of the pagan gods, and secondly, back then, all the athletes competed naked. And so the Jews, wanting to not appear blemished, because to the Greeks, any mutilation of the body is considered a blemish, were actually undergoing surgery to reverse the effects of circumcision. So we have this great Hellenistic apostasy in the church when Israel began to fall away from the ancient faith. So we have the same three changes in the church as took place under the Egyptian era. Now after Greece, the fourth kingdom arose, which was Rome. And we know that Rome, the fourth kingdom, was diverse from all the other kingdoms. And how was it diverse? Well, Rome was actually not a kingdom. It didn't actually have a king. Rome was a republic. And this is why it was diverse. All the other kingdoms had kings. Rome, we're told in Daniel, was to push to the south towards Egypt. It would push to the east towards Syria. It was proud and ruthless, very much like the Assyrians. They were well known for just arbitrarily just killing everybody they could find. In fact, if we look at the destruction of Jerusalem, 2 or 3 million Jews died, and every single other Jew that was found left alive was sold as a slave, and Israel was depopulated of Jews. Now again, just like we saw with Assyria, Rome was initially Judah's ally. In about 168 BC, Judah had sent ambassadors to Rome, asking Rome to protect it against the king of Syria, just like had happened with Assyria. It was actually Ahab had asked the king of Assyria to protect it from the king of Damascus that was part of Syria. So, while being initially Judah's ally, Rome destroyed Jerusalem, just like Assyria had destroyed Israel. And Rome carried away the last 2 tribes of Israel, just like Assyria had carried away the first 10 tribes of Israel. Just like Assyria had relocated its capital to Babylon and made an image of the beast that was to come after it, Babylon, Rome relocated its capital to Constantinople to make way for the papacy, or the beast that was to come. So it also created an image of the beast. Here again is this summary chart. The first kingdom was Babylon. At this time there's a one-world government created. The man of sin arises, beginning with Nebuchadnezzar and ending with Belshazzar, adequately describe the attitude of the man of sin to God. Now, the end of the first kingdom, the beginning of the second kingdom, God's people called out of Babylon. And the dominion of the first kingdom is taken away, but it's not destroyed. It's only destroyed at the end of the second kingdom, when there's an increase in knowledge, and the fourth kingdom is founded. And it was founded as a republic. At the time of Alexander the Great, when Greece became a world empire. At that time, the Roman Republic began to establish itself as a nation. Now, under Greece, the church was reorganized, it fell away. Then at the end of the Greek Empire, there's a change of government, the Fourth Kingdom. And what's that change of government? Well, Rome stopped being a republic and became an empire. It now did have a king, an emperor, and now it would be ruthless. Whereas before, as a republic, it was fairly moderate in its ways. It was almost lamb-like. Now, at the end of the Fourth Kingdom, we have a creation of the image of the beast, which was the creation of the papacy and the adoptions of the principles of the papacy by the Roman state under Constantine about 320 AD, but it wasn't the papacy ruling, it was still the Roman state. The papacy itself wouldn't obtain power till 538. And we know that Jerusalem was destroyed by Rome also towards the end of that era. So what we've seen here is that history repeats. But it doesn't just repeat once. The spirit of prophecy says, bear this in mind, history is being repeated. The perils that God's people encountered in past ages, they will encounter again, intensified. The manuscript releases 381. So, if it's already repeated once, and we're going to encounter them again, that means that there's a third fulfillment. And we see this very clearly in another statement from the Spirit of Prophecy in the Paulson collection, page 123. She says, read in my books, Patriarchs and Prophets, and Great Controversy, the story of the first great apostasy. History is being repeated and will be repeated. Read then and understand. In Patriarchs and Prophets, we read about the kingdoms in Genesis: Babel, Elam, Egypt, and Assyria. But in the Great Controversy, we read about the papacy. and the lamb-like beast that belong to a third fulfillment of Daniel's 4 kingdoms. Ellen G. White here refers us to Genesis and then points us forward to Revelation, and she says the history is being repeated, that's once, and will be repeated, that's twice, and Ellen G. White tells us to understand, which means there's something for us to think about. Now, the Bible makes this very, very clear. In Ecclesiastes 3:15, that which has been is now, and that which is to be has already been. And God requireth that which is past. It's not just that it happens by accident. God requires it to happen. And so that which has been already 2 times will be again. Now, we say, oh, but there's no more empires. True, there's no empires, but there's what we call hegemonies, which is an empire, but it's not under one king. A hegemony is a collaboration of nations led by one nation. We speak of the United States hegemony, and so effectively it is an empire, but it's not established militarily, but through diplomacy and control of the economy. So let's have a look at how that which is to be has already been. Ellen G. White tells us very clearly, in speaking of Daniel's prophecies, the prophecy of the 11th chapter of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. Manuscript Releases, Volume 13, page 394. Now this is written in 1909. Much of the history, not a little bit of the history of the 11th chapter of Daniel, but much of the history of the 11th chapter of Daniel. Or, dare I say it, most of the history. Here's another quote. The light that Daniel received direct from God was given especially for these last days. The visions he saw by the banks of the Ulai and the Hiddekel, the great rivers of Shinar, are now in the process of fulfillment, and all the events foretold will soon have come to pass. Bible Commentary, Volume 4, page 1166. Now this was written in 1896. So the question begs to be asked, how is it that the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8 and chapter 11 of Daniel are now in 1909 and 1896, how are they now in process of fulfillment? They were all fulfilled at least before 1798. Isn't that when the papacy received its deadly wound? How is it that in 1909 they are now in the process of being fulfilled? Now, this has been a mystery for Adventists for well over 100 years. But it need not be a mystery, because the Bible and Spirit of Prophecy has given us enough information to understand that history repeats itself. We say, well, what kingdom arose after ancient Rome? And most people have been taught to say, oh, no kingdom arose because Rome was the last kingdom. Well, actually that's not true. A new kingdom arose called the Holy Roman Empire, and this kingdom ruled for about 1,000 years. And we read about this kingdom in Daniel. This is the kingdom of the man of sin. Now, the Holy Roman Empire actually subdued the world militarily. Kings such as Clovis, king of the Franks, and Charlemagne militarily submitted the nations around them to the papacy. And if they wouldn't submit, well, they were exterminated. They created a completely new world order that had never before existed, because this new world order wasn't a civil ruler ruling over the nations, but this was a religious ruler ruling over the nations. This was a new world order like there had never been. Again, there was a common tongue, and this tongue was Latin, and it was spoken throughout the entire Holy Roman Empire. There was the worship of the mother and child, only this time we didn't call it Ishtar and Tammuz, it was called Mary and Jesus, or Madonna and child. Again, we have sun and moon worship in Sunday sacredness and in the celebration of Easter or Ishtar. This empire was going to persecute for 1,260 years. You might say, well, Holy Roman Empire didn't rule for 1,260 years, but while it was declared formally to be an empire under Charlemagne, it had actually begun hundreds of years before under Clovis, king of the Franks, who first submitted his kingdom to the papacy, and it didn't really take in all of Europe until the time of Charlemagne. About the time of the Reformation, or just before in the 1400s, the Turks invaded from the east, as the Medes and Persians had done, and they attacked and destroyed Constantinople and set up the Ottoman Empire. Now, while they didn't completely overthrow Europe, what they did was that they made all of the scholars flee from Constantinople into Western Europe, taking with them all the manuscripts of the Bible. And so Bibles came from the east. Between the Bibles and the Ottomans, the two of them broke the power of Rome in 1555. Because, on one hand, the Bible led to the creation of the Protestant Reformation, which would have been quickly crushed by the armies of Rome if it hadn't been for the fact that the armies of Rome were busy trying to fight off the Ottoman Turks. And so the two of these powers combined to break the power of Rome in 1555, when a treaty was struck called the Peace of Augsburg. And what this treaty did is it said that the Protestant states were freed from being subject to the Pope. And so the Pope no longer now had complete control over Europe, and Protestants were able to flee into the Protestant states to protect themselves. This period of the time of the Reformation is called by secular historians the period of early modern Europe. During this period, the Roman Catholic culture was preserved, as was the Church, and the Protestant churches, like the Lutheran Church, preserved much of Roman Catholicism and definitely its culture. And likewise with a lot of the other national churches in the Protestant countries. They preserved the basic structure of Catholicism within them. They didn't accept the Pope, but they kept its culture and teachings. And Rome itself wasn't destroyed. It just transformed itself into a centre of learning through the help of the Jesuits and became, the leading educational centre in Europe, whereas before it had been the centre of ignorance. And at this time, just like during the period of Abraham and during the period of the Medes and the Persians, Protestants were called out of Rome. They were called across the sea west to the New World, just like Abraham had been called across the river west to Canaan, and how the captive Jews had been called west out of Babylon, again across the river to the Promised Land. That was the period of the Second Kingdom. It wasn't really a single kingdom, because during this third repetition, they're not empires, as we've said. And so after this period of the Second Kingdom arises the period of the Third Kingdom, which we call secular modern Europe. And this arose at the time of Napoleon. Now in 1798, the French Revolution came to an end. And Napoleon came to power. And he came from the West. And he overthrew all of the states of Europe. Now, in fact, Napoleon saw himself as repeating the history of Alexander the Great. In fact, he asked the Directory, which was the French government, for an army so that he could go into Egypt and Syria and fight the same battles and conquer the same lands that Alexander had conquered. And they actually gave him this army, and yes, he went and did those things. But in addition to that, he destroyed, or his general Berthier attacked Rome, shut down the Vatican, and destroyed the papacy. Again, this is in the Third Kingdom, just as it happened the two previous times in history. At this time, we have the rise of the Industrial Revolution, which is an explosion of science and learning. And Daniel, telling us about this time, says that many shall run to and through, and knowledge shall be increased. And that's exactly what happened. This Third Kingdom, the start of the Third Kingdom, coincides with the last days. Now, what Napoleon did is that he spread throughout Europe and throughout the world, in fact, the revolutionary ideas of France. Now, these revolutionary ideas had come from a period known as the French Enlightenment, about 20 to 30 years before the French Revolution itself. And what this French Enlightenment was, is that the philosophers had begun to study the pagan philosophies of Greece. And in the pagan philosophies of Greece, they discovered such concepts such as democracy, atheism. In fact, evolution was taught by the Epicureans, which is one of the ancient Greek schools of philosophy. So we have this mixture of secular culture and pagan gods. As we know, the French Revolution, they worshipped the goddess of reason in this time, in this period of secular modern Europe, just like it happened, just as we find in Egypt and ancient Greece. During the time of the Third Kingdom, Europe split into two competing factions, as the Triple Entente and the Central Powers. Just like the King of the North and the King of the South in Egypt, and just like in Greece, and just like Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, during this time of the Third Kingdom, as has always happened, we have some changes in God's church. First of all, there's a reorganization. The Christian churches give way to the remnant of her seed with the independent establishment of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And it begins to become prosperous. In the middle of the 1900s, the church prospered materially. And towards the end of the 20th century, the church begins to fall away from faithfulness and become like the churches around her, as in all the previous fulfillments. Now, what happens at the end of the Third Kingdom? Well, we read in Revelation that there's a fourth kingdom, and this kingdom is a dragon in sheep's clothing. We know it's a dragon because it speaks like a dragon, and the Bible says that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh, in Matthew 12:34. And so this beast with two lamb-like horns in Revelation is actually a dragon. And we remember that a dragon in Revelation chapter 12 represents imperial Rome, the fourth kingdom. Again, this kingdom is diverse from others. How is it diverse? Well, it's a republic. At a time when all the other kingdoms, apart from France, which was in revolution, were monarchies, this fourth kingdom was arising as a republic. And it has lamb-like horns, and is initially a defender of Protestantism, just like Rome had been a defender of Judaism, and Assyria had been a defender of Israel. But we know that this beast with the lamb-like horns will put to death all who do not receive the mark of the beast and worship his image. So again, it repeats exactly the same history. It will transform itself into an image of the beast, and if history is to repeat, it will also relocate its capital in doing so. Let's now look at the summary chart. The First Kingdom, the Holy Roman Empire, created a one-world government under the authority of the papacy. At some point, its dominion was taken away, and God's people were called out of Babylon across the sea to the Promised Land. At the end of the period of the Second Kingdom, in 1798, the First Kingdom is destroyed, being the Holy Roman Empire. There's an increase of knowledge, Industrial Revolution, and the Fourth Kingdom, the lamb-like beast, is founded as a republic. From that time, when the Third Kingdom comes into power under Napoleon and his Napoleonic Empire, the church is reorganized, there's a falling away, and that continues until there's a change of government in the Fourth Kingdom. And now the Fourth Kingdom begins to speak like a dragon. And some point towards the end of the Fourth Kingdom, the image of the beast is formed, and the church is destroyed through persecution. And so we see the parallels. Babel was the type of Babylon which foreshadowed the Holy Roman Empire and the rule of the man of sin. After Babel, we have Elam, which foreshadowed Medo-Persia, which again foreshadowed divided Europe under the Reformation. And again, all the same prophetic specifications are met. It comes from the east, it's an allied kingdom. The Catholic states were first, but the Protestant states become strongest. Rome was preserved and the Protestants were called out. The Third Kingdom, Egypt, and Greece, which had its cultural capital in Egypt. They were all replayed again in the history of modern Europe. And we know that today in modern Europe, our thinking is Greek. We think like Greeks. We don't think like Romans. We don't think like Persians or like Babylonians. We think like Greeks. Secular mindset. Again, modern Europe, Napoleon came from the West. The first great king, Napoleon. And after that, the kingdom was taken away, not to his posterity. Kingdom split into the upper and lower, or north and south. There's an increase in science. Rome is destroyed. The church is reorganized. And under the fourth kingdom, it comes from the north. It's ruthless and proud. It will destroy the church, harass the saints, and it will create the image of the beast. So we see that prophetic history is fulfilled not once, not twice, but 3 times. Actually, it's repeated 3.5 times, because after the lamb-like beast, Revelation tells us about the final kingdom. Now, the Bible tells us about the final kingdom that will be ruling over the earth at the time of Christ's second coming. And so we read in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 to 9. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. And now ye know what withholdeth, that he might be revealed in his time. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work, only he who now letteth will let, until he be taken out of the way. And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming. Even him whose coming is after the working of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders. Now, the Christians in the first century all understood these verses to be speaking of Rome, the fourth kingdom, and that the Antichrist would not arise until imperial Rome had been swept away. Yet that was 1,600 years ago, and these verses are talking about the coming of Christ. So that same history will be repeated in the very last days, when the fourth kingdom is again swept away to make way for the 10 kings that rule 1 hour with the beast. And speaking of the rise of this final kingdom, we read in Revelation 13:3, and I saw one of his heads as it was wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. And we know that this beast comes to power through the aid of the beast with 2 lamb-like horns. And we read about this final kingdom in Revelation 17:12-14. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but received power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. For God has put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree, and give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. Now Revelation describes this kingdom as a woman riding a beast. Again, the man of sin will be exalted above God. There will be a new world order. The world will be subdued militarily. There will be a common language, which in this case is English. Again, the mother and the child will be worshipped. Sunday will be worshipped. And the Sunday laws will be enacted. And the saints will be persecuted. Now that history will repeat again is not just a nice theory that we've developed. In fact, it's something far more profound, as we shall see. The picture on the left is a picture from the Middle Ages of the Tower of Babel half built. Now, the European community, when they were trying to advertise their establishment of the European Union, they came out with a poster that said, Europe, many tongues, one voice. And again, if you look at the picture, ignoring the satanic pentagrams above it, you notice that it looks almost identical to this famous painting of the half-built Babel. Their aim is to rebuild the Holy Roman Empire, which they know, and we now know, represents Babel, just like Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt Babel. They are rebuilding Babel. They know it, and they're proud of it. Some more evidence of this Again, on the left is that same picture from the Middle of Ages of Babel, half built. And on the right-hand side is a picture of the European Parliament. And you'll notice that while it's a modern building, it's made to look like a half-finished Tower of Babel. Now, if this isn't enough evidence of the fact, guess what sculpture sits outside of that same building? Well, it's a picture of a woman riding a beast. This isn't just a coincidence, because if we look at another sculpture outside of the European Council building, there's another sculpture, a different one, of a woman riding a beast. And so they well know that they are preparing, once the fourth kingdom is swept away, for the final rise of Babylon. And they know that their time is soon. They know it's only half finished, but it will soon be finished. Here's another poster. This came out, front cover of Der Spiegel, which is a very well-respected German magazine. The front page titled Good Morning Europe, and again, a woman riding a beast. They know what they're doing, and they want to repeat history. They will repeat history. But we know that Babylon every time has been destroyed by kings from the east. And Daniel tells us about the stone that comes from heaven, and Revelation tells us about the king from the east. And we know that a loud cry will come. Babylon is fallen, come out of her, my people. And we read about the fall of Babylon in Revelation 16:12. And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. Who are these kings from the east that overthrow Babylon? Well, Isaiah 44:28 tells us, speaking of God, that saith to the deep, Be dry, and I will dry up thy rivers. That saith of Cyrus, He is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, Thou shalt be built, and to the temple, Thy foundation shall be laid. And we know that Cyrus is a figure of the second coming of Christ, and the rebuilding of the New Jerusalem. And so we come to the end of this world's history. Seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought ye to be in all holy conversation and godliness, looking for and hastening unto the coming of the day of God, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. 2 Peter chapter 3 verses 11 to 12. And so, in summary, we see that history, prophetic history, is repeated not once, not twice, but 3.5 times. 3.5 is an important number that occurs many times in both Daniel and Revelation. And now we're during the time at the rise of the fourth kingdom. And we know that the final movements will be rapid ones. The fourth kingdom will not last for very long, because the beast and its Babylonian kingdom is already half built, and it will only rule for one symbolic hour, and Christ will come. So what? So what if history repeats? Well, the so what is that Daniel gives us actually quite a detailed blueprint of final events in the history of the world, and we'll be looking at this blueprint in some detail in later presentations. In the Review and Herald, August 31, 1897, we read, We are standing on the threshold of great and solemn events. Many of the prophecies are about to be fulfilled in quick succession. Every element of power is about to be set to work. Past history will be repeated. Old controversies will arouse to new life, and peril will beset God's people on every side. And God wants us to be prepared for these conflicts and this peril. He wants us to know what's coming ahead. Satan, however, would rather we were ignorant. Ellen G. White tells us light must come to the people through the agents whom God shall choose, who will give the note of warning that none may be in ignorance of the purposes of God or the devices of Satan. It is his design to keep them in ignorance of what shall come upon the earth. The people must not be left to stumble their way along in darkness, not knowing what is before them, and unprepared for the great issues that are coming. Review and Herald, 24th of December, 1889. And so not only are these prophetic events before us, they're not just 200 years in the past or 1,000 years in the past, they're before us, but we will actually witness their fulfillment. We read, the Lord wants to impart to us increased light. When the angel Gabriel was about to unfold to Daniel the intensely interesting prophecies recorded for us who are to witness their fulfillment, the angel said, "Be strong, yea, be strong." Daniel 10:19. We are to receive the very same glory that was revealed to Daniel, because it is for God's people in these last days that they may give the trumpet a certain sound. Manuscript Release Volume 1, page 40, and Review and Herald, 24th of December 1889. So, the prophecies of Daniel, where we read that much of the history was to be repeated, wasn't just for thousands of years ago, it is for today. It is for us who will witness their fulfillment. And in these series of presentations, we're going to see how it is that we will witness the fulfillment of these prophecies. Now, you might say, well, what about time? What about the 1260-day prophecy? What about the 2300-day prophecy? They can't repeat. Well, of course they don't repeat. Because what repeats is the history, much of the history, not necessarily the time periods. So the events of history repeat. Now we know that time periods don't repeat because the time periods are specific to each era. See, under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon ruled for 70 years. But Mystery Babylon, under the papacy, only ruled for 1,260 years. So straight away we see that there's no repetition. And we're told that the beast that rules with 10 kings, at the end, that will only rule for 1 hour. Each time Babylon has ruled is ruled for a different time period. Time will never again be a test, but in hindsight we can see that some things may take a similar amount of time to play out. So for example, Elijah prophesied for 3.5 years and Jesus' ministry lasted 3.5 years. And so there's some similarities there, but those similarities aren't a prophetic test. What's important are the events, not the time. Now, it's only the events in the history of the nations that repeat, not events in heaven. The heavenly sanctuary is not cleansed twice. In conclusion, the thing that hath been is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. Ecclesiastes 1:9. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before us. So, nothing is new. What's before us, the events before us, they're not new. And certainly what I've shared with you today is not new. Now, the principle of the Bible is that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall every word be established. 2 Corinthians 13:1. And that's exactly what we've seen. We have presented 3 witnesses. First, we have presented the testimony of history itself and shown how history itself has repeated not once, but twice. Secondly, we have shown the witness of the Bible that says what has been is now, and what is to be is a repetition of the past. And we have presented the third witness, the witness of the spirit of prophecy, which tells us that history not only is being repeated, but will be repeated. We have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto ye do well that ye take heed, as unto a light that shineth in a dark place, until the day dawn and the day star rise in your hearts.
That message, that's better. That message is going to blow the world away. Do you see the power We've had two witnesses of a cycle of history that says that this history is going to repeat a third time. And we're in that third phase of history. When I first saw this, it was like, wow, that's amazing. And the summary of the information, how the kingdoms and the prosperity we see within the Third Kingdom after the French Revolution, when the Third Kingdom comes to power in the spirit and the power of Greece, we see the rise of the Adventist, the calling out of Babylon, the rise of the Adventist church, the reorganization of the church, the prosperity of the church, and then the falling away of the church. All of this has taken place. The parallels are all there, aren't they? So the United States is going to prepare the way for the resurgence of the papacy. We know this. We understand this. But by looking at the past, now when we read the book of Daniel, we're reading the book of Daniel for us today. Not just in a few minor verses here and there, but the whole book is now upon whom the ends of the world has come. This whole book is now being read for us. And I know that was an hour presentation, and I'm sure your minds are probably a little bit full up. But the important thing is the pattern. It's the pattern that we're looking for, and I'm very excited. I haven't watched that presentation for some time. There's nothing in that presentation that I would disagree with, that I could pick up that time going through. We will have a break, and there are some other presentations I'd like to show you. I don't know whether go for a run around to clear your mind a bit. The next couple are about half an hour each. Would you like to continue and look at these? Because we're going to go into Daniel 11 and unlock some of this history and show how that the events of the Third Kingdom of Greece have played out, and the Third Kingdom in our era of France ends in 1989 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And from 1989, we know that the US becomes the number one world superpower. It is undisputed. The Fourth Kingdom is established. And now we only have to wait for the transfer of this republic to an empire. It will become an empire. And then if, as this gentleman, Reuben, has indicated, and I think there's good case for it, you will see three kings arise in the United States. During that empire, in which the Seventh-day Adventist Church, as we know it, will be destroyed. And Sunday worship will be established and all those things. So let's have a prayer. Hopefully most of this material I've sent to you. If you want copies of these presentations, we have them. So you can go over them and over them. Father, we just thank you for this opportunity to look at this information. I believe that this pulls together many of the pieces of inspiration to make the books of Daniel and Revelation come alive to us, to show that the Daniel 2 image is repeated in these last days, and that the Fourth Kingdom is the United States of America, preparing the way for the resurgence of Rome. And I pray for each of us here and those that are watching online and will watch online, that we would study to show ourselves approved, to see whether these things are so, to be Bereans, to study the history, to get the evidence and know how to give that trumpet a certain sound. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. So I advise you to go and get some fresh air. We'll come back in 10 minutes and we will continue.